Is Will Shield. I'm one of the joint program directors of the Doctor in Educational and Child Psychology program at EduExe University. I'm also a child and educational psychologist, so I spend half my week working for university, half my week working for children and schools in and around the Southwest.
Hello, can you hear me, Will?
Yeah.
Good. My name's Lata, Ramoutar, and I am a joint programme director too with Will on the Doctorate of Educational Child and Community Psychology. So I spend half of my week doing that, and then the other half I'm an educational psychologist working in Devon schools and academies in that area.
So we're planning to talk to you for a little bit this afternoon about doctoral wellbeing. We realise how warm it is, so we don't plan to talk to you solidly for an hour. We think we've probably got about half an hour to talk through some research we've done and also some implications for supporting postgrad students who are doing doctoral level studies. We're going to talk primarily about trainees on our course, and we'll give you a flavour for why it's perhaps a little bit different than other postgrads. But we'll try and make those links back to all postgraduate students, particularly those doing doctorate study. Please let us know if you can't hear us or if the sound goes or the screen stops working. It would be great as well if we could have some cameras on for those who are happy to have cameras on, just so we're talking to people rather than to black Zoom screens. But also we really appreciate you might not want to have your cameras on. Okay, so this is the rough outline for today. So rationale for the research we did into wellbeing, some feedback of our research findings, and most importantly, perhaps the implications of practice for us and for you in your roles. And perhaps if you are in the session today, you could just comment in the chat briefly about what your role is, whether you're within the university or kind of outside the university, just so we know how to pitch this as we go.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of the context of our course. There are some similarities with PhDs, but there are some quite distinct differences. And when Will and I were thinking about how to structure this course, this session, we sort of thought about the differences. So kind of taking you through it, our doctorate is a three-year one. And you'll notice that we don't call our students, we call them trainees. And that's because it's a professional doctorate. So we're not only expecting them to complete doctoral thesis, but we are also expecting them to change their identity and move from one profession to another to become a competent educational psychologist. So the course is split into three areas: academic, practicum, and research. And it is a hard course. They know that when they get on it. It's highly competitive to get on. I think there might only be 13 universities in England and Wales that offer the course. I'm sure Will correct me if I'm wrong. But they've competed quite strongly to get onto the course. So when they're on it, they're aware that it's basically a kind of a race to the finish. It's a long 3 years. All of them have previous professional experience as either a teacher or a teaching assistant or youth justice workers, and the teaching and the educational experience might be with early years or primary, secondary, or FE. So you know, we get a real range of educational, usually professionals, but we also get people who've been social workers. So I suppose what I'm saying by that is these are people who have already been in stressful jobs and have some understanding of how they manage a stressful experience. And hopefully the people that we get on are able to reflect on how they have managed those experiences in the past in a helpful way. So I guess that's sort of the context in terms of who we have on the course. The course is funded by the DfE. It's a bursary system, and although the bursary means that there's some security in how much money they receive each month, It's not particularly a lot, I think our trainees would say, and certainly with the context of the cost of living crisis, it's been increasingly difficult. So the course is accredited by the British Psychological Society and the Health and Care Professions Council. So there's a real pressure on us, on Will and me and the team, to make sure that all of the trainees reach a certain standard of competence in order to safeguard members of the public when they work with them. So that means that there has to be a certain high level of attendance. They have to show that they have engaged and they really understand the role, what it is and what it is not. The BPS is really clear about stipulating what trainees must receive by way of a university tutor, who's a qualified educational psychologist, and a placement supervisor as well. So when they're on placement, they'll also receive supervision from an educational psychologist. I guess the mean age of our trainees is probably, I could work it out, but it's probably kind of early 30s. And the range is probably from mid-20s to early 50s. Okay, so what we've noticed is that life happens to people who cover this very broad age range. And by life, I mean pregnancies, I mean falling in and out of love, I mean buying houses, moving, being diagnosed with chronic illness, with terminal illness, to getting kittens. All sorts of things happen to people aged between mid-20s and early 50s. And the size of the course, which is probably quite important, our course is small. So each year there are between 10 and 12 trainees. So at any one time, we are supporting between 30 and 36 trainees. So it's really very intense. It's a lot of direct teaching in person, in a room, which is quite small, and using your own experiences, both personal and professional, to help you to develop who you are as an educational psychologist. Okay, so just a kind of aside, I guess, that the research that Will carried out was carried out after the main part of the COVID pandemic, so after the lockdowns. And that's important because certainly when I look at research around wellbeing, there's sort of a bit of a divide in terms of, oh yeah, but that was pre-COVID. So I think it's important to recognise that COVID for us and for the course and for the trainees brought its own difficulties. As you probably all know, universities shut their campuses. So all of that direct, in-person, one-to-one teaching, really close relational work was interrupted by screens, and we had to work out very quickly. I mean, it doesn't look like we've done particularly well, but we had to work out very quickly how to find the mute button, how to get all of our teaching on Teams, how to make sure that we had things like Mentimeters and things that were participatory, and we could try and engage with our students as well as we ever had before. And it was really difficult for us, but it was also doubly difficult for our trainees, who experienced accommodation changes, who suddenly were very isolated if they weren't living within a family unit. They were taking on quite a lot of information about how to be an educational psychologist, some of which can be quite heavy. Some of them lacked access to technology, the skills to use the technology, and some of them didn't have the space. Some of them were sitting on their beds with their laptops propped on their knees, and I suspect, we've all done that in our COVID experiences at some times. And obviously that extra pressure really had a massive impact on the well-being and mental health of our trainees. And in response to that, the wider our wider systems and organisations like the Association of Educational Psychologists try to respond quite carefully by making sure that we thought about the quality rather than the quantity of our teaching and of the placement. And they sort of advised us to think about the individualised approach to each trainee, which was absolutely important and necessary, but again, sort of put pressure on us to make sure that we could understand and connect with new trainees on the course, and understand their individual circumstances. And then since COVID, we've had the cost of living crisis. And on our course, year one is absolutely about coming to our campus and sitting with our group of 9 or 10 or 12 trainees. So the location of our trainees is from all over the southwest. So some live in Falmouth, in Penzance, some live in Bristol, and they are expected to come from Monday to Friday, 10 to 5, every day, for most of their year one. And so that, together with the cost of living, when they're spending £50 to come down to Exeter and they've had a session cancelled, that's really frustrating for them. And, you know, we have had trainees crying in the room, you know, really, really difficult times. So I suppose all of this context is to tell you kind of what you already know, really, which is things are difficult to be a postgrad doctoral researcher. It's tough, and has been even tougher, I think, in the last few years. So I've added the Schmidt and Hansen work, which really was about, it sort of identified, based on 17 studies, it was a literature review, and it carried out sort of SWOT analysis addressing the strengths and weaknesses of the research around student wellbeing, doctoral student wellbeing. And one of the conclusions was that the more student-centred approach that doctoral support can be, the better. And that actually we should really focus on that as a long-term goal. I guess all of that led to Will, fabulous Will, who's now going to talk, to carry out the research, and he's going to talk about the design and talk about his findings.
Thanks, Lata. I think the context is really important for this, and the context for me was that I've been in university for several years, but was doing the PCAP program at the time. Now the academic practice qualification, and one of those assignments was to do some research into an area of professional practice. So I chose the wellbeing aspect before we knew that COVID was on the cards, but it just so happened to coincide with COVID. So we've tried to keep COVID separate without knowing you can't separate these things at all. So when we look at definitions of wellbeing, I think we agree that it's a multifaceted and subjective construct. I don't think any researcher or any psychologist would say this is what wellbeing is and this is the only definition. I think everyone recognises it comes from different places and people have different views about that. And Pollard et al. Carried out a study a little while ago, and they said that higher education institutes, the working definition of mental health or wellbeing was around 43%. What we know is that things have changed, and more institutions now have definitions of wellbeing, have wellbeing teams, and really place wellbeing at the forefront of support for students. And I think what we've reflected on with our students, our trainees, is that often we signpost them to our postgraduate colleagues in professional services and wellbeing, and they access them to quite a high level, which is really positive, because I think 10, 15 years ago, that wouldn't have been quite the case. And I think wellbeing services were much harder to access and perhaps not as talked about as much. So the World Health Organization talks about mental health being a state of well-being in which the individual realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to their community. I think we hold that definition in mind when we think about what we mean by well-being, the different definitions of well-being. Lars, do you want to talk to this, or do you want to carry on?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't. I can't. You're in complete control, so I'm just sort of pointing and watching. So I guess just going back to the WHO definition, I guess what's really helpful about that is that there's sort of implicit message, if you like, that what we know is that mental health has an intrinsic value, and it's really integral to our well-being. And for us, I guess I always ask myself, you know, what can interrupt the course, and how can we support trainees to ensure they finish? Because it's a DFE funded doctorate, we kind of have to support, we want to, but we have to support trainees to finish. We can't really have people deciding, no, it's not for me, I made a mistake, I'm off. So we have that's sort of part of the focus. And I guess in contemporary psychology, sort of two perspectives of well-being have been kind of brought together. So there's the hedonic well-being, which emphasizes the feeling good. I'm not feeling good at the moment, it's the hottest day of the year, but generally I feel quite good. It's around kind of minimalizing psychological discomfort, you know, the sort of sensory pleasure, the immediate pleasure that we might get out of doing sort of short-term things to make us feel good. So, and then there's the eudaimonic well-being, which is more around kind of self-actualization, finding our purpose, thinking about our own resilience, our ability to problem solve, and living the life we want to, living a meaningful life with purpose. And kind of my understanding at the moment of well-being is that those two come together, and actually you can't really think of one without the other. You know, short-term gratification is unhelpful if there's no longer-term purpose underpinning it. So those come together, and I guess our job as program directors is to think about how our high-pressure course can support both aspects of those well-being definitions. So I guess Will's study, as I understand it, is that it sort of it reflects how we approach our support of the trainees, in that we kind of adopt an interdisciplinary approach to wellbeing. We think about a range of components around their psychological functioning, their well-being, and not only that, I guess what's important to think about is that we think about the interface between trainees and tutors and us. And we're very clear, we're getting clearer on when it's our turn to support and when it's our turn to signpost them to new services. So what we're not doing in this, and in the research, is we're not expecting to save them or to carry them through. We know that at times we have to rely on, we're part of the process and we have to rely on other services.
Okay, so in the Pollard report, which looked at wellbeing in universities and took that broad definition, they made a few comments about the evidence gaps, one of which being the effectiveness of wellbeing services. One was about under the influence of higher education on mental health and wellbeing, which was different to that experienced by the general population. One was about understanding students' expectations for an experience of support, students' risk and barriers to seeking help, and understanding prevalence of wellbeing issues. And of course, this research is now quite old, but there's a real paucity of further research that looks into specifically wellbeing within doctoral student populations at university. So, drawing upon Hargreaves' study looking at doctoral wellbeing in 2017, we looked at how doctoral wellbeing warrants exploration in a greater or more, I guess, more in-depth detail than other studies had looked at wellbeing. And we thought, particularly for our students, it's a unique course with unique pressures. So how do we understand wellbeing that isn't just about saying to students, well, go for a walk, give yourself some time off, step away from the laptop when you can, because we know that those are practical things to support wellbeing that actually you don't have time to do when you're doing a course like ours. So it felt disingenuous to give that sort of advice. So Imperial College in 2009 carried out the first wellbeing study that I could find, certainly, of doctoral research in the UK using the impact analysis. And they reran the study in 2014. And what they were looking at was those aspects of doctoral study that had the most impact on wellbeing for students. Their key findings were that stress and frustration related to research and career uncertainty and the wellbeing was typically lower for women and later stage doctoral students. So for the purpose of this study, we defined TEP doctoral wellbeing, so trainee educational psychologist doctoral wellbeing, as that part of a trainee educational psychologist's overall wellbeing that's primarily influenced by their position as a doctoral student and which will be influenced by support from their university-based academic and professional tutors and their placement supervisors. What we're basically saying here is that we were looking at those aspects of being a postgraduate student in university, trained to be an educational psychologist, that had most impact on your well-being outside the pressures of everyday life. And that definition is important to hold on to as we go through this talk. So the research aimed to find out what trainees around England and Wales said about this. And we chose England and Wales because they're the universities most similar to us. So England and Wales have the same training route. It's all funded by the Department for Education, but it's slightly different to our colleagues in Northern Ireland and Scotland. So we focused on training education psychologists across England and Wales and wanted to get their perspective of, how can we as tutors, as people that work at universities, support their doctoral wellbeing? So 2 key research questions for this. The first one was about what aspects of doctoral study have the most impact on wellbeing, and the second was about how we as tutors can be most effective in supporting the wellbeing. Because although we were doing things that we thought were really good, we're psychologists, we think we have a good understanding of wellbeing, supporting wellbeing. I really wanted to find out, well, what do trainee education psychologists say about this? Do they feel that we are doing the right things, or is there more we can do? But also there's an element of sharing practice. As Lata said, we're a very small course. We have between 10 and 12 students a year. Other universities, similar size, some a bit bigger. But even so, you're working within very small cohorts of people. So you ask a cohort of people what they think, and we can do that. But that might be quite different to what other people at the university say. So we tried to find out what lots of trainee psychologists would say and how we could apply that to our situation here in Exeter. So a questionnaire went out to trainees in England and Wales in June 2020. So you'll see this was as we came out of lockdown, but COVID was still quite prominent, but it was made very clear this questionnaire wasn't about COVID, but clearly we couldn't separate COVID from responses. We had 117 responses, and that represents about just over 20% of trainees who are currently funded at that point. And you'll see the split between year 1, 2, and 3 of the 3-year doctorate. So more year 1s answered it, slightly tailed off in year 2 and 3, but a relatively even split there. The questionnaire contained a doctoral wellbeing scale. So this was based on Juniper's research, and I slightly changed to make sure it fitted our doctoral students who weren't doing PhDs and did have placement demands as well. But it looked at questions in these different domains. So these are domains that I asked questions on the questionnaire to say, well, what aspects have the most impact? And you'll see on this list here that there were 7 domains from health and home, supervision, development, research, facilities, university, and social. I won't read all the definitions there, but that helps to explain what they actually mean. So participants were asked to rate different questions, different items from 1, which was not at all important, bothersome, through to 5, which is extremely important, bothersome. And what we were really trying to find out here was what aspects of research, what aspects of supervision, what aspects of the university have the most impact on wellbeing. There were also 3 questions that we posed at the end of the questionnaire, which we asked participants to rate from 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree, to 5 being strongly agree. One was about my experience as a doctoral student being a positive one. The second was about how tutors, people working on de-ed-psych programs feel the importance of supporting tech wellbeing. And then a question about whether there's more that academic professional tutors could do to support wellbeing. And finally, there were 3 open questions asked at the end. Now, these questions were open responses, so participants write whatever they like, and often we find the questionnaire studies don't lend themselves well to gaining qualitative data. However, each of these 3 questions generates an awful lot of data from people, and I think my reflection on that was wellbeing was such an important issue, was being talked about so much as we walked into COVID, that people were really wanting to share their opinions and views, and this led to some really rich analysis. So what do we find? Well, we find there was no difference between overall doctoral wellbeing through different years of training. You remember those research I mentioned a while ago, that said typically wellbeing was found to be lower in later stage doctoral students. Well, this wasn't the case in this sample. But I calculated mean impact scores to represent the impact of each domain on doctoral wellbeing, and I'll explain what they are in a second. So I don't expect you to have to read all these numbers and make sense of it straight away, but the key bits in yellow are that a higher score signifies a greater negative impact on that factor on overall wellbeing. If you remember, trainees or participants were asked to rate 1, which is not important and bothersome, to 5, which is extremely important and bothersome. And you'll see across all year groups, years 1 to 2 and 3, health and home had the most impact on doctoral wellbeing. And we can suspect that. And as Lata alluded to earlier, we have students who go through some significant life events. And our anecdotal views would be that when trainees are on the course and home is going well and there's good support networks in place, the course is manageable. When things go wrong at home, we see a real impact on wellbeing on the course as well, and everything feels unmanageable all at once. Interestingly, year 2 had an elevated score here for research. And that was interesting because I hadn't featured in year 1 or 3. But my reflections were the year 2 at this point of COVID had started their doctoral theses, they'd started their data collection, and suddenly had to change things as we went into lockdown. So the context of the course is the March in year 2 tends to be the time when trainees start collecting data and they've had their ethics approval through. But of course, March of 2020 was when lockdowns happened, universities and schools all closed down, and data became very difficult to get hold of. So lots of year 2s at this point around the country were changing their research proposals and their way of collecting data. And that's why I think it's elevated for year 2 above year 1 and 3. So 10 items reported to be the most important and bothersome in relation to doctoral wellbeing. And I won't read all of these out, but I will highlight a few. The first being the 66% of respondents said that having a high workload that impacts your private life was very important and bothersome and really had an impact on wellbeing. And of course, that's a relatively obvious finding in some respects. But I think as we work down the list, there were some interesting kind of items that came up. So, for example, making unreasonably high demands of yourself. We know that trainees often come from backgrounds where they have worked very hard, they're very competitive program to get onto. They've often been quite established professionals in their area, so teachers, session use coordinators, mental health professionals, and do have high expectations of themselves and making high demands of themselves. Another one that stands out was number 6, particularly in terms of being unclear about the required standard of work for your thesis. And this is important for our course because our trainees don't necessarily come in with a strong research background. So although they're doing a doctoral level qualification, they haven't always done a master's degree. So often they come from undergraduate through onto the doctorate program, often with many years in between if they've been working. And so this is a real area that we have to support our trainees with developing their research skills so they do understand what it means to write a thesis and how to get there. There are some real positives with this question. So these are the questions where we asked to rate from 1 to 5. And you'll see here that, overall my experience as a doctoral student at this university was a positive one. Well, the mean score for that was 4, so very high, with nearly 74% agreeing or strongly agreeing with that statement. Supporting training wellbeing being important to academic professional tutors, well, 64% agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. However, there was also quite a large percentage of people, 53% of respondents, that said there's still more that tutors can do to support wellbeing. So although respondents to this survey said that my experience has been positive and supporting wellbeing is important to my tutors, actually there's still a lot more we could do. And that's the feeling that that we have as tutors, that although we are always doing as much as we can, there's always more we can do. And we want to know what we can do and how we can change our approach. So how can we be most effective in supporting wellbeing? So although this is specifically about academic and professional tutors, so they are people who work on doctoral programs for supporting education psychology training, actually these I think can relate to anybody who's involved in the supervision and development of postgraduate students and doctoral students. So the way I analysed this was to use reflexive thematic analysis to look at the themes and sub-themes from this open question. This wasn't originally going to be a large part of the research because I wasn't expecting to get much data back, but given the richness of the data through the questionnaire, there was a lot we could find. So one theme came up was academic professional tutors. And you'll see here on this busy map, there are lots of other facts, lots of other themes that were generated from the data. And we haven't got time to look at them all, so we're just going to focus on the academic professional tutors. So there were three sub-themes that I generated in the data. One was about relationships, one was about communication, and one was about providing support and taking action. And that was an important theme because trainees often reported to feel very well supported, but questioned about how action was taken. So there's one thing feeling supported, there's another thing feeling that your tutors are going to take action when needed. Communication was important, and there's some really clear some really clear suggestions from participants about how communication through a wide university systems could be improved, but particularly then with your supervisor or a tutor, around having expectations, about communication being responsive, about consistency. And then relationships, of course, being at the top there, so that trust and mutual respect that came through relationships and getting to know each other well. What we've talked about so far is that on our course with small student numbers, we spend a lot of time with trainees, we get to know them very well, very quickly. I think our experiences of working on other postgrad courses, so particularly the MSc courses, is that you don't get that opportunity to develop such a strong relationship with people you're supervising. And that can really be a challenge for wellbeing, we would suggest. Okay, so Lata and I are going to talk to this, I think, together now. And this really moves research from the questionnaire and what the main findings were into the practicalities of what we can do and what we think we can do and what we've been working on over the past couple of years to really try and support wellbeing for trainee psychologists. But I can't remember which ones we're doing.
I think, why don't you do 1 and 2?
Excellent. And you'll jump in for 3 and 4.
And I'll do 2 and 4, yeah.
Excellent. So the way we've structured this is to say that there's 6 key things that we think we can do, and we would ask and suggest that other supervised doctoral students do. And the first one is about facilitating relationships. I started to talk on the previous slide about how difficult that can be with bigger courses. But our experience is that by prioritizing time and taking time to build those relationships is crucial to supporting wellbeing, because that enables trainees or students to feel they can come to you as a supervisor and say, look, things are really tough. But by that point, you probably already know things are tough because you've got to know more about them and their lives and the challenges they face. So adapting support. So we on the course have lots of regular check-ins about wellbeing, both as a group and also individually in supervision meetings. And there's regular sort of water cooler conversations. So bumping into people, having a chat, seeing how their weekend was, but making sure wellbeing is talked about quite openly. I talked earlier about how maybe 10 years ago or so, there was less access of wellbeing services at universities, and now wellbeing services are overrun with support, with people wanting support. But I think that's a great thing, because it means we are making wellbeing a really common and normal thing to be talking about, and trying to find real ways to adapt the course and the support we can provide for the course to meet those needs of people, which, like I said, isn't just about asking people to do yoga or going for a walk. It can be about more structural changes and things that we can do as course leaders.
So the third one is clear communication, and this has been really important for Will and I, because although we've been tutors for a long time, we're fairly new to the programme director role. So I think what was very important was to think about how we can make and maintain very close connections with each trainee that we have, that's ours, if you like, but to do it in a way which provides consistency and predictability, reliability, and then trust. So it wouldn't be helpful for us to tell a trainee sort of our own pressures and our own worries. We've only got 2 weeks and I can't possibly complete that draft. But at the same time, we thought that we do need to kind of co-construct with the trainee what's reasonable to expect. So that, for example, if they come to us with an issue, they won't expect us to answer that day, but they know that we've read it and we will respond within a certain time frame. So we as a team have spoken to each other and to the trainees about the expectations, and that's in the handbook. So we're really transparent about how we're going to communicate with the trainees, when we're going to communicate with the trainees, and that's in our working agreements. So we're much clearer on that in terms of our relationship. And then in terms of our marking and our sort of summative assessments, we've really worked hard to make sure that our feedback is consistent across our team, so that when the trainees talk to each other, they don't think, oh, so-and-so marked that, I was bound to not do well. So we're much clearer about how we feedback, and being more timely about when we feedback. So that hopefully that a trainee knows what to expect. Placement concerns. So our year 2s and 3s mainly spend something like 60%, a very high level of their years on placement, and that means in a local authority, usually within the Southwest. And again, we've given a very clear message that although they're spending much of their time on a placement and they have a supervisor in that placement, that they're still ours, they're still on the course, and that we have an agreement with each one of them, again, co-constructed with them, about how we're going to stay in touch with them. So we don't leave anyone worrying about any aspect of the course. They know that they can contact us. And if it's an issue about the placement, that we will champion them and we will amplify their voice. That has led to a lot more trainees coming to ask for help, but that's good, because obviously the alternative would have been that they wouldn't have asked and they would have just worried, to the point where some of them may have left the course. Practical support. Okay, so, and then the fifth one, so smooth, Will and I, on this handover. So the practical support, that's also something, so in terms of the course element, there's only so much we can do. So for example, from COVID, a lot of trainees really wanted to think about working, attending hybrid. And we've had to be really clear and give a very consistent message that that is not something that we can teach to. And that's a difficult message for some whose children are ill and they can't come in. It's not great in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, and it's a difficult message for us to give. But what we have tried to do is be much clearer about what we can do. So, for example, every fortnight we have a private study day. So instead of coming in Monday to Friday every week, every other week they come in Monday to Thursday. We're trying to make sure that every other week we have a day which is teaching online. So again, they can work at home. We're much clearer about our assessments and the time when they should be due in. So we've explored pinch points, and we've also developed a structure within the course where trainees can come and talk en masse to tutors, so that they also help us to think about deadlines and the assessment and the workload overall. So we're much clearer. So in a way, it isn't about being a pushover and agreeing to everything that all of the trainees want, but it's about being much more communicative, much more transparent about what we can change and what we can't change.
And finally, the impact of the pandemic can't be forgotten. And I think we, at the time, need to provide us reassurance. There's some practical things we had to do in terms of trainees feeling safe to go on placement and going to schools and working with vulnerable children and families. And I think as we come out of that awful period of time, we look back at, well, what lessons did we learn? How did we do things differently during the pandemic? We can't go back to hybrid teaching. That was just an impossible situation when you're trying to train psychologists. What we can do is recognise that a key aspect of wellbeing is having the finance and the money to be able to get to university every day. So are there times we can put things online? Can we deliver some online sessions? Or can we adjust the timetable so that things can be done a bit differently? And that really is a long-lasting impact of the pandemic. So what do we do? What do we stop doing for the pandemic we haven't started again? And what do we start doing during the pandemic that we can carry on? And so it's reflecting that quite often. So our kind of final summary really is that so lots of factors have an impact on wellbeing and have a positive impact as well. And I think it's important to finish with this because it's very easy to focus on those things that have a detrimental impact on wellbeing. So we know that to encourage trainees to feel well in themselves, to feel that they can keep on going, they have to have a manageable workload. And we have a responsibility to manage that and time that in a way that they feel they can cope with that, despite the structure we have to work within at the university level. Trainees have to be able to make reasonable demands themselves and recognise their strengths, and we have a responsibility in that as well through supervision and tutorials to identify that. Trainees have the right to be clear about the required standard of work for their thesis and for other academic work, and that's linked to having the confidence and knowledge and research skills. So on the programme, we've really thought about how we can have more research methods teaching at an earlier stage in year 1, so that as they move into their thesis stage in year 2 and 3, they're feeling more confident where possible. Feedback and having constructive feedback has a real positive impact on wellbeing, and having tutors who emphasise the importance of wellbeing, as we've talked about quite a lot so far today. We've talked about having positive and trusted relationships with tutors and supervisors and clear communication. And the key thing we think is being supported by tutors. So having tutors and supervisors around trainees who say, look, we'll stop, we'll support you, we'll help, and we'll take action when we need to. So we're going to finish on a hand-picked quote from one participant number 94, in response to the question, what else do you think your course tutors could do to improve tech wellbeing? And their response was, honestly, they couldn't do more. My tutors are amazing. And that's a photo of the cohort that finished their degree yesterday. We'll have the last teaching session yesterday at Exeter. You'll notice if you know St Luke's campus, you'll perhaps recognise that bench. And we picked this photo because we thought, you know what, they've got through 3 tough years of training and they've come out at the end still smiling and ready to go into the profession as psychologists. Last, do you want to finish on anything?
No, just to say thank you for listening. It's a really hot afternoon. I'm not sure how many of you still are listening. Maybe cameras are off. I think Will and I have really appreciated the opportunity to share what we're doing on our course. It's a little bit like writing a thesis where no one wants to hear the detail, but we'll tell it anyway to anyone who is sort of stuck in the room with us. So we're really grateful for anyone who's listening. And we'll take any questions.